cultural evolution may be blocking ecological solutions. Cultural evolution refers to the way humans create tools and social systems to adapt to and shape their environments. Find out how the tension between our cooperative and competitive natures may be preventing us from solving the ecological crisis humanity faces. Like most boys, I played a lot of team sports growing up. It was mostly pickup games in the schoolyard or in the huge backyard our neighbors the Finleys had. I also played organized softball in the summer. It always seemed to me that team sports involved a contradiction between coaching unity within our own group and encouraging rivalry with our opponents. Now that I'm ostensibly an adult, I belong to a credit union, which is a cooperative financial institution that belongs to its depositors or members. Even so, my credit union has to compete with privately held commercial banks. Scholars from a range of disciplines have thought about this tension between cooperation and competition among humans. In his groundbreaking work, The Evolution of Cooperation, Dr. Robert Axelrod outlines how natural selection leads to cooperative behavior, as does Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. In his classic essay, The Tragedy of the Commons, Dr. Garrett Hardin showed how groups sharing unowned resources tend to overuse and deplete them. Nobel laureate Dr. Elinor Ostrom challenged that assumption by outlining the design principles by which local communities can pool their resources. Dr. Tim Waring is an evolutionary biologist at the University of Maine. He's been studying the dynamics of social cooperation and cultural evolution for the past 2 decades. Professor Waring led a study that the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society B published last week. The scientists wanted to know how humanity's relationship with nature affects our approach to addressing ecological issues. The researchers began by examining changes in the way human societies use natural resources. They delved into how humanity's ecological niche has changed based on our resource use and how those changes affect the natural world. The team's findings show that over the last 100,000 years, the kinds of resources we use, the intensity with which we use them, and the impact we have on the environment have all increased. This is due to a process that scientists call cultural adaptation to the environment. As Professor Waring explains, human evolution is mostly driven by cultural change, which is faster than genetic evolution. That greater speed of adaptation has made it possible for humans to colonize all habitable land worldwide. This process is self-sustaining. As our groups get larger, our cultural evolution goes faster, consuming even more resources and driving still further growth. For the last 100,000 years, this has been good news for our species as a whole, but this expansion has depended on large amounts of available resources and space, Professor Waring said. Ecologists have started calling this period of human dominance the Anthropocene epoch. The resource and space requirements are the bad news on the horizon. We're running out of room now, the ecosphere is reaching its physical limits, and climate change and mass extinction threaten our resource access and even our survival. In the next phase of the study, the team reviewed historical cases of cultural evolution toward more sustainable human systems. They noticed 2 patterns. First, these sustainable systems were usually reactive, only springing up after a major failure to manage resources. Secondly, most of the sustainable changes only called for cultural evolution inside a community, not between groups. One problem is that we don't have a coordinated global society which could implement these systems, Professor Waring said. We only have sub-global groups, which probably won't suffice. But you can imagine cooperative treaties to address these shared challenges. So that's the easy problem. So what's the hard problem, according to Professor Waring? It's cultural evolution's tension between cooperation and competition, as discussed earlier. This means global challenges like climate change are much harder to solve than previously considered. It's not just that they are the hardest things our species has ever done. They absolutely are, according to Professor Waring. The bigger problem is that central features in human evolution are likely working against our ability to solve them, he continued. To solve global collective challenges, we have to swim upstream. The study isn't all bad news. As Professor Waring put it, there is hope, of course, that humans may solve climate change. We have built cooperative governance before, although never like this, in a rush, at a global scale. So we seem to need a blend of optimism and realism to solve these issues. We definitely need to view cultural evolution's obstacles much more seriously. The researchers' findings tap into a growing realization that humanity's survival calls for a new phase in our cultural evolution. We need to work toward a future age that some are calling the Ecozoic era. It's a vision of a radically changed humanity with a new story of global interdependence instead of the Anthropocene view of our planet as a chunk of resources we exploit. For at least 50 years, the environmental movement has recognized humanity's need to, in Professor Waring's phrase, swim upstream against cultural evolution's exploitation. As Katharine Hepburn explains to Humphrey Bogart's character in The African Queen, nature, Mr. Allnut, is what we were put in this world to rise above. Professor Waring wrapped up the discussions by saying, if our conclusions are even close to being correct, we need to study this much more carefully. We always have more to learn if we dare to know.